The story begins not with a bang, but with the quiet, desperate struggle of poverty in the harsh, inland town of Corleone, Sicily in 1930. On a cold November day, the 16th to be precise, Salvatore Riina drew his first breath into a world that offered him very little. Corleone was not the romanticized land of Godfather lore. It was a place of backbreaking labor, feudal injustices, and a deep-seated, simmering resentment between the impoverished peasant class and the often absentee landowners who held all the power. Into this crucible of hardship, young Toto was born, and it would shape every fiber of his being. His father, Giovanni Riina, was a poor farmer, and the family's existence was a relentless cycle of work and want. Tragedy struck early, a common enough occurrence in those days, but one that would undoubtedly harden a young boy's heart. When Toto was just 13 months old, his father died, succumbing to a sudden illness that medical care of the time and their social standing could not combat. This left his mother, Maria, a widow with 4 children, to fight a daily battle for survival in a society that showed little mercy to the weak. This early, profound loss of a patriarch, of a provider, imprinted upon Riina a brutal lesson about the world. It was unforgiving, and only the strong could hope to navigate its perils. The concept of a nurturing, protective society was a fairy tale. The reality was a dog existence where sentimentality was a luxury no one could afford. He was a small, wary child, but what he lacked in physical stature, he began to cultivate in a fierce, unyielding will. The dusty, sun-scorched streets of Corleone were his first classroom, and the lessons he learned there were not of reading and writing, but of power dynamics, respect, and humiliation. He saw how the Gabalotti, the estate managers who acted as intermediaries between the landowners and the peasants, held real power. They were the local kings, the men who decided who worked and who starved, and they were often intertwined with the emerging mafia families, the Capi. The term mafia itself was rarely spoken aloud. It was an unspoken presence, a system of governance that operated in the shadows, parallel to the official Italian state, which was viewed with distrust and seen as a distant, corrupt entity that offered no justice to the people of Sicily. For a boy like Riina, the path to a better life through legitimate means was non-existent. Education was a fleeting dream. Economic mobility was a myth. The only visible avenue to power, to respect, to a life beyond sheer subsistence, was the one paved by the men of honor, the uomini d'onor. They were the ones who commanded fear and, by extension, respect. They were the ones who settled disputes, who provided a form of rough justice, and who, crucially, controlled the black market, a vital lifeline during the fascist regime of Benito Mussolini, who had launched a severe crackdown on the mafia, forcing it deeper underground, but failing to eradicate it. By his early teenage years, Riina was already immersed in the criminal underworld, running errands, acting as a lookout, and learning the brutal codes of conduct that governed this secret society. He was not a scholar, but he was an astute student of human nature and violence. He understood that in this world, a reputation was everything. and a reputation was built on a foundation of unwavering ferocity and absolute reliability. His small size earned him the nickname Ukurtu, the short one, but he ensured that no one would ever mistake his stature for a lack of resolve. He was quick to anger and even quicker to violence, understanding that a single, brutal act could save him from 1,000 future conflicts. This was the boy molded by poverty, fatherlessness, and the harsh realities of a marginalized existence, who was ready to step onto a larger stage. The stage was set for his formal introduction into the secret brotherhood that would become his family, his religion, and his weapon. The year was 1945. The world was at peace, but for Salvatore Riina, a different kind of war was just beginning. The formal initiation of Salvatore Riina into the Corleonesi Mafia family was not a grand ceremony in a cathedral of crime, but a clandestine ritual performed in the hidden folds of the Sicilian countryside, a rite of passage that would bind him to a new, deadly family for life. The year was 1945, and he was just 14 years old, a testament to the raw, fearsome reputation he had already cultivated in the brutal streets of his hometown. The man who sponsored him, who became his mafia godfather, was the formidable Luciano Leggio. Leggio was a rising star in the criminal firmament of Corleone, a man whose psychopathic tendencies and ambition mirrored and even exceeded the young Riina's own burgeoning darkness. The initiation ritual itself was a profound and terrifying moment, steeped in archaic symbolism and brutal pragmatism. In a secluded farmhouse or perhaps a hidden barn, away from prying eyes, the young Toto would have been led before a table upon which lay a gun, a dagger, and a sacred image, often a saint or the Virgin Mary. The senior mafiosi present would pierce his finger, drawing a drop of blood, which would then be smeared onto the image. He would then set the holy card aflame, passing it rapidly from hand to hand while reciting an oath of loyalty. The words of this oath were a covenant of silence and blood. I swear to be loyal to the Cosa Nostra. If I betray, my flesh should burn like this saint. This was the moment of his rebirth. He was no longer just Salvatore Riina, the poor fatherless boy from Corleone. He was now an omod honor, a man of honor. The term was a grotesque misnomer, for the honor he swore to was not one of chivalry or virtue, but of omert, the law of silence, and absolute obedience to the organization. This new family provided a structure, a hierarchy, and a purpose that the legitimate world had denied him. Under the tutelage of Leggio, Riina's education in the highest arts of criminality accelerated exponentially. Leggio was not a traditional, somewhat paternalistic mafia boss of the old school. He was a revolutionary of violence. He saw the mafia not just as a means of earning illicit income through protection rackets, black marketeering, and controlling local contracts, but as an instrument of raw political power that could be seized through unparalleled brutality. Riina was an eager and apt pupil. He learned that violence was not merely a tool for enforcement, it was a language. A single, shockingly brutal act could communicate a message more effectively than 1,000 whispered threats. It could paralyze rivals, intimidate witnesses, and cement a legend. he and Leggio formed a deadly symbiosis. Leggio provided the strategic vision and the audacious ambition, while Riina became his most trusted and ruthless enforcer, a human weapon of terrifying efficiency. Their first major power grab within the Corleonese Casca was a declaration of this new, savage philosophy. The current boss, Michel Navarra, was a figure from the old world, a doctor, a man who understood the value of maintaining a veneer of respectability, who preferred to rule through mediation and political connections, using murder as a last resort. To Leggio and his young protégé Riina, Navarra was weak, a relic standing in the way of total domination. The conflict between the old guard and the new, brutal wave erupted into a bloody internal war known as the Matanza di Corleone, the slaughter of Corleone. It was here that Riina truly came into his own. He was not just a foot soldier. He was a principal architect of the carnage. The streets and dusty country lanes around Corleone became a hunting ground. Ambushes were a daily occurrence. Bodies, often mutilated and riddled with bullets, were found in car trunks, dumped in fields, or left on country roads as grim warnings. Riina was personally involved in dozens of these murders, his hands, on approach, earning him the unwavering loyalty of his own faction and the abject terror of his enemies. The most significant of these early murders was the audacious assassination of Navarra's beloved nephew, a calculated act of provocation designed to lure the old boss into a trap. It worked. The war culminated on August 2, 1958, when Michel Navarra and his driver were ambushed on the road to Lercara Fritti. Their car was shredded by a hail of over 200 bullets from Lupara shotguns and machine guns fired by Leggio, Riina, and their hit squad. With Navarra's death, the last barrier to their absolute control of Corleone was removed. Luciano Leggio was now the undisputed boss, and Salvatore, Toto, Riina, still only in his late 20s, was his right-hand man, his underboss, and the living embodiment of the new, terrifying order they had forged in blood and fire. The small, wiry boy from the poor family had not just joined the Mafia, he had helped reinvent it in his own brutal image, and his thirst for power was far from quenched. The brutal victory over Michel Navarra did not usher in an era of peaceful dominion for Luciano Leggio and his young lieutenant, Salvatore Riina. Instead, it triggered a period of relentless persecution from the Italian state, a time of flight, shadowy existence, and a hardening of their criminal resolve that would forever sever their ties to any semblance of a normal life. The sheer audacity and violence of Navarra's assassination, a prominent doctor and a figure with political connections, could not be ignored by the authorities, even in a Sicily long accustomed to mafia violence. Leggio and Riina were now the most wanted men on the island. Forced to abandon the open streets of Corleone for a life on the run, a life lived in the shadows of remote farmhouses, hidden basements, and mountain caves. This period of latitanza, of being a fugitive, was not a setback for Riina. It was a further, crucial phase of his education. It was during these years of constant movement and paranoia that he refined the strategies of secrecy and communication that would later become the hallmark of his reign. he learned to trust only a tiny, insular circle of Corleonese men, men bound to him by blood ties and shared murders. He mastered the art of the pizzini, tiny, coded handwritten notes, long before they became widely known, using them to pass instructions through a chain of trusted messengers, ensuring he never had to use a traceable telephone or show his face in public. This forced isolation from the wider world only served to deepen his Corleonese chauvinism and his contempt for the state. The world outside his immediate, controlled environment was the enemy, a world to be manipulated, corrupted, or destroyed, but never joined. Meanwhile, the law was closing in. In 1964, Luciano Leggio was finally captured, not for the murder of Navarra, but for a different crime. His arrest marked a pivotal moment for Riina. While Leggio remained the nominal boss from behind bars, the day-to-day command of the Corleones clan increasingly fell onto Riina's shoulders, alongside another ruthless rising star, Bernardo Provenzano. This transfer of power was seamless, a testament to the deadly efficient structure they had built. Riina, now in his mid-30s, was no longer just an enforcer. He was a strategist, a CEO of crime, and he saw opportunities that his imprisoned mentor could not. The 1960s and early 1970s were a time of massive, state-funded public works projects in Italy, particularly in the impoverished South, aimed at stimulating the economy. The construction industry was a river of money, and Riina, from his hidden command posts, directed his clan to wade into it with voracious appetite. Through a campaign of intimidation, bombings, and assassinations, the Corleonesi muscled their way into control of public contracts in and around Palermo. Any construction company that wanted to work had to pay a pizzo, a protection fee, to Riina's men. More than that, the clan demanded that their own front companies be used for supplying concrete, sand, and other materials, often at grossly inflated prices. This systematic looting of public funds not only made the Corleonesi immensely wealthy, but also integrated them deeply into the legitimate economy, allowing them to launder their money and gain influence over politicians and businessmen. But this move into Palermo's lucrative territories inevitably brought them into conflict with the more established, more cosmopolitan mafia families of the city itself. Families like the Bontade Inzerillo and Badalamenti viewed these upstarts from the impoverished interior as uncouth, barbaric peasants. They failed to grasp the fundamental shift that had occurred. The Palermo families still operated on a model that valued negotiation, shared interests, and a certain level of coexistence with the state. Riina and the Corleonesi operated on a doctrine of total war. They saw the Palermo families not as rivals to be negotiated with, but as obstacles to be exterminated. The stage was set for what would become the most brutal and transformative conflict in the history of Cosa Nostra, the Second Mafia War. And at the heart of this gathering storm was Salvatore Riina, no longer in the shadow of Leggio, but emerging as the central, terrifying architect of a plan not just to dominate the mafia, but to subjugate it completely to his will, to transform the entire organization into a single, monstrous entity under his sole command, an entity that would no longer fear the state, but would dare to declare war upon it. The Great Mafia War of the early 1980s was not a spontaneous eruption of violence. It was a meticulously planned genocide, a campaign of extermination orchestrated from the shadows by Salvatore Riina with the cold, calculating precision of a military general. While the more established Palermo families, led by figures like Stefano Bontade and Gaetano Badalamenti, were enjoying the spoils of their harrowing, trafficking alliances with the American Cosa Nostra, Riina and his Corleonesi were quietly building a coalition of the discontented and the ambitious, forming secret pacts with other mafia families who felt marginalized by the Palermo elite. More importantly, they were stockpiling an arsenal of weapons and compiling a comprehensive death list, a ledger of every rival, their associates, and even their relatives who posed a potential threat. The war began not with a declaration, but with a series of surgical, devastating strikes designed to decapitate the opposition's leadership in one fell swoop. The opening salvo, which signaled the true beginning of the carnage, was fired on April 23, 1981. Stefano Bontade, known as the Prince of Villagrazia for his elegant lifestyle and extensive political connections, was driving home after a lavish dinner party. His car was stopped at a traffic light in Palermo. At that moment, a team of Corleonesi hitmen emerged from the darkness and riddled his vehicle with Kalashnikov fire, killing him instantly. The message was unequivocal. No one, no matter how well connected or powerful they seemed, was safe. This was followed, just over a month later, by an even more audacious hit that demonstrated Riina's newfound reach and ruthlessness. On May 11, 1981, Salvatore Inzerillo, a key rival and a major figure in the transatlantic heroin trade, was gunned down in front of his son. But the killing did not end there. In a grotesque display of symbolic violence meant to terrify the entire mafia world, Inzerillo's right arm was severed from his body. The message was clear. This was the hand that had sworn the oath of loyalty to Cosa Nostra, and this was the punishment for betrayal. A punishment decided not by a traditional mafia tribunal, but by the unilateral decree of Salvatore Riina. The killings became a relentless tide. Dozens, then hundreds, of mafiosi and their associates were hunted down and murdered. The streets of Palermo became a free fire zone. Bodies were found in cars blasted by shotguns, in the trunks of abandoned vehicles, or simply left on the pavement as a public spectacle. The Corleonesi employed a tactic of lupara bianca, the white shotgun, where victims were made to completely disappear, their bodies dissolved in acid or buried in hidden, unmarked graves. Their fates forever a mystery to their families, a psychological torture that extended the terror beyond the grave. Riina, from his various hidden apartments and farmhouses, directed this slaughter with an iron will. He understood that to win, he had to shatter not just the leadership of the rival families, but their very will to resist. He targeted their financial operations, their drug shipments, and their most trusted lieutenants. The old rules of Cosa Nostra, which forbade the killing of women and children, were callously discarded. When the son of the murdered Inzerillo, a young man who dared to speak of revenge, was hunted down and killed, it sent a shockwave through the underworld, demonstrating that Riina recognized no limits, no codes beyond his own thirst for absolute power. The war was also a massive intelligence operation. Riina had successfully turned key members of the rival factions, exploiting their greed or fear, turning them into informants who provided the precise locations, habits, and vulnerabilities of their own bosses. This inside knowledge made the killings chillingly efficient. By the time the bloody crescendo of the war subsided around 1983, the landscape of Cosa Nostra had been irrevocably altered. The Bontade and Inzurlo families were virtually annihilated, their members dead or fled to America. Gaetano Badalamenti was in exile, later to be convicted in the famous Pizza Connection trial. The Corleonesi faction, under the de facto leadership of Salvatore Riina, now stood unchallenged. He was no longer just the boss of Corleone. He was the Capo di Tutti Capi, the boss of all bosses, of a now centralized and terrifyingly unified Sicilian mafia. He had achieved this not through diplomacy or tradition, but through a calculated application of mass murder that had cowed every other potential challenger into submission. The peasant from Corleone now ruled the criminal underworld of Sicily, and from this position of unprecedented strength, he would make his most fatal and arrogant calculation that this same strategy of overwhelming, shocking violence could be used not just against his mafia rivals, but against the Italian state itself. With the internal opposition within Cosa Nostra ruthlessly exterminated, Salvatore Riina now stood at the apex of a criminal empire of unprecedented power and brutality. But this victory did not bring a retreat into the shadows. Instead, it emboldened him to launch a frontal assault on the very institutions of the Italian state, which he perceived as the only remaining obstacle to his absolute dominion. The 1980s were a transformative period for the Italian justice system, marked by the courageous work of a small group of magistrates in Palermo who were beginning to use the first real legal tools to effectively combat the mafia. Chief among these were Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, two Sicilian judges who understood that the mafia was not a collection of isolated criminals, but a single, complex organization that could be defeated by following the money, using pentiti, collaborators with justice, and building cases based on extensive, interconnected evidence. Their work culminated in the Maxi trial of 1986-87, a monumental judicial proceeding that saw hundreds of mafiosi, including Riina and his top lieutenants in absentia, put on trial based on the groundbreaking testimonies of Tommaso Buscetta, the first major boss to break the code of Omert. The Maxi trial was a seismic shock to Cosa Nostra. For the first time, the state was not just rounding up foot soldiers, it was using the mafia's own rules and structures against it, presenting a comprehensive picture of its hierarchy and its crimes, resulting in hundreds of guilty verdicts and life sentences. To Riina, this was an act of war that demanded a declaration of war in return. He saw the Maxi trial not as a legal process, but as an insurrection that had to be crushed with maximum force. The state had to be shown that challenging Cosa Nostra was a suicidal endeavor. The initial response was a campaign of intimidation and murder aimed at anyone associated with the trial. Witnesses, lawyers, and even journalists were killed. But Riina's ultimate targets were the architects themselves. He believed that by eliminating the symbolic heads of the anti-mafia movement, he could decapitate the state's will to fight. This led to a period of open warfare between the state and the mafia, a war conducted with car bombs and assassinations that would bring the terror directly to the Italian mainland. The first catastrophic blow fell on May 23, 1992. Giovanni Falcone, his wife Francesca Morvillo, and 3 police officers were traveling from the airport in Palermo to the city along a road known as the Capi bypass. As their motorcades sped along the highway, Riina's assassins, who had tunneled into the base of the road and planted over 400 kilograms of explosives, detonated the device by remote control. The explosion was so powerful, it registered on local earthquake monitors. The blast tore a crater 30 feet wide and 20 feet deep in the highway, obliterating the lead cars and throwing the armored car carrying Falcone and his wife hundreds of feet through the air. All 5 were killed instantly. The assassination was not just a murder. It was an act of terrorism designed to shatter national morale and demonstrate the state's impotence. The message from Riina was clear. We can reach anyone, anywhere, even the state's most protected heroes. The nation was plunged into mourning and outrage, but for Riina, the job was only half done. Less than 2 months later, on July 19, 1992, his hitman struck again. Paolo Borsellino, who had taken up his friend Falcone's mantle with grim determination, was visiting his mother in Palermo. As he arrived at her apartment building on Via D'Amelio, accompanied by 5 police officers, a car packed with explosives was detonated by remote control. The entire street was turned into an inferno of shattered concrete and twisted metal. Borsellino and all 5 officers were killed. The twin massacres of Capi and Via D'Amelio represented the zenith of Riina's power and his arrogance. He was no longer just killing rivals or informants. He was executing the Italian state's most senior officials in broad daylight. He believed, with the cold logic of a tyrant, that such overwhelming, shocking force would force the government to negotiate, to retreat, to grant him and his organization a form of tacit immunity. In his mind, he was not just a criminal. He was the leader of a sovereign entity, a parallel state, and these acts were the battles required for its recognition. This calculation, however, would prove to be his most profound and fatal miscalculation. Instead of bowing to terror, the Italian people and their institutions, shamed and galvanized by the sacrifices of Falcone and Borsellino, found a resolve they had previously lacked. The state, which had once seemed hesitant and corruptible, now mobilized with a unified purpose to find and capture the man who had dared to declare war on Italy itself. The brutal assassinations of Falcone and Borsellino, intended by Salvatore Riina as a masterstroke to break the state's will, instead became the catalyst for his own downfall, unleashing a retaliatory force of such magnitude and determination that it would forever change the balance of power between the Italian state and Cosa Nostra. The public outrage was immediate and volcanic. The funerals of the magistrates were national events, marked by a profound sense of collective shame and a simmering fury that the mafia had been allowed to grow so powerful. The government in Rome, under immense pressure, enacted a series of emergency decrees, granting anti-mafia investigators sweeping new powers and resources. The most significant change was the massive deployment of over 7,000 soldiers to Sicily, a move not seen since the fight against banditry after the unification of Italy. Their presence on the streets, guarding public buildings and patrolling highways, was a powerful, visible symbol that the state was reasserting its monopoly on force. More importantly, the investigations were now supercharged. The pool of magistrates in Palermo, now led by a new generation of fiercely determined prosecutors, worked under military protection, sifting through every shred of evidence, every wiretap transcript, and every financial record with a renewed, almost vengeful focus. The key to unlocking Riina's location, however, lay not in a piece of paper or an electronic bug, but in the human heart, in the growing disillusionment and fear within his own organization. The sheer, indiscriminate brutality of the bombings in Capaci and Via d'Amelio had sowed the seeds of dissent. Many mafiosi, particularly those from traditionalist factions, believed that killing judges and using bombs in this manner was a dangerous folly, a provocation that would bring ruin upon everyone. They saw Riina's strategy not as strength, but as a reckless megalomania that threatened the very survival of Cosa Nostra. Furthermore, Riina's own methods within the organization had become increasingly paranoid and despotic. He was ordering the murders of his own men on the slightest suspicion of disloyalty, sometimes based on the whispers of rivals seeking to settle scores. The once sacrosanct rules of Cosa Nostra were being trampled by the boss himself, creating an atmosphere of terror within the ranks. It was from this cauldron of fear and discontent that the first crucial break emerged. A mid-level mafiosi named Leonardo Messina, horrified by the bombing campaigns and fearing for his own life in the purges that followed, decided to break the code of Omert. His testimony in late 1992 provided investigators with a vital, inside look at the Corleonesi structure and, crucially, confirmed that Salvatore Riina was not a myth, but a very active, hands-on boss living clandestinely in Palermo itself. But Messina's information was general. The final, precise key would come from an even more unexpected source. For years, the Carabinieri, Italy's military police, had been running a highly secretive and patient operation, painstakingly building a profile of Riina's inner circle. They focused not on finding the man himself, but on mapping the movements of his most trusted drivers and bodyguards, the men who formed his protective shell. They identified a key figure, Baldassare Di Maggio, a Corleonese mafiosi tasked with ferrying messages and people to and from the boss. Di Maggio, however, was a man with his own problems. He was involved in a bitter internal feud and realized that Riina was likely to have him killed to resolve the dispute. Faced with the choice between almost certain murder by his boss or a chance at life by betraying him, Di Maggio chose self-preservation. he made contact with the Carabinieri and agreed to collaborate. His information was breathtakingly specific. He revealed that Riina was living not in a remote farmhouse, but in a modern, anonymous apartment in a residential neighborhood of Palermo, via Bernini 13, under the alias of Signor Gaspar Troia. He provided details of Riina's habits, his security protocols, and, most importantly, the car he would be using on the morning of January 15, 1993, a white Renault Twingo. The Carabinieri, led by General Gianni Di Gennaro and Colonel Sergio Di Caprio, known as Capitano Ultimo, planned the capture with military precision. They could not risk a shootout or a prolonged siege. It had to be a swift, surprise snatch operation on the open street. On that cold January morning, a large team of undercover Carabinieri officers saturated the area around Via Bernini, blending into the early morning traffic. Capitano Ultimo himself was at the wheel of one of the unmarked cars. As the white Renault Twingo emerged from the garage and pulled into the street, it was immediately boxed in by several vehicles. Armed officers swarmed the car, yanking open the doors before the driver or the passenger could react. The passenger was a short, stocky, well-dressed man in his early 60s. As the officers pulled him from the seat, he did not resist. He simply looked at them with an expression of cold, contemptuous fury. When asked to identify himself, he replied, "I am Salvatore Riina. After 24 years as a fugitive, after ordering over 150 murders, after waging a war that had claimed the lives of Italy's best and brightest, the beast of Corleone was finally in chains. The myth of his invincibility was shattered in an instant on a quiet Palermo street. His capture was not the end of the story, but it was the end of his reign of terror and the beginning of a new, even more complex and treacherous chapter for the Sicilian Mafia and the Italian state. The capture of Salvatore Riina on that January morning in 1993 sent shockwaves through Italy and the international criminal underworld. But it did not bring an immediate end to the violence. Instead, it triggered a complex and bloody aftermath that revealed the depths of his connections and the sheer audacity of his final strategies. His arrest was a profound psychological victory for the state, a moment of national catharsis proving that no mafioso, no matter how powerful or elusive, was beyond the reach of the law. The images of a handcuffed Riina, his face a mask of cold fury, being led away by Carabinieri, were broadcast endlessly, symbolizing the fall of a modern-day tyrant. He was immediately incarcerated under the strictest prison regime possible, known as 41 bis, which isolated him completely from the outside world, severing his ability to command his empire. However, the beast, though caged, was not yet declawed from his maximum security cell, and in the frantic days and weeks following his arrest, evidence emerged of a plan so shocking it suggested Riina had been preparing for the possibility of his capture by launching a final, apocalyptic campaign against the state. Investigators discovered that he had given orders for a series of devastating terrorist attacks to be carried out on the Italian mainland, targeting symbols of cultural and economic power. The rationale behind this strategy was twofold and chillingly pragmatic. First, It was an act of revenge and intimidation, a message that even with their leader in prison, the Corleonesi remained a formidable force capable of striking at the heart of Italy. Second, and more cynically, Riina and his remaining lieutenants believed that by creating a climate of panic and insecurity, they could force the government to reverse the harsh 41-bis prison regime and negotiate more favorable conditions for mafia prisoners, perhaps even securing the repeal of the laws that allowed pentiti to collaborate. This strategy culminated in a series of bombings in 1993 that brought the terror of the Mafia war directly to the civilians of Rome, Florence, and Milan. In May, a car bomb exploded near the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, damaging the renowned art museum and killing 5 people, including an entire family. Just a few weeks later, bombs detonated in quick succession in Rome at the Church of St. George in Velabro and near the Lateran Palace, ancient and symbolic sites. The most devastating attack came on the night of July 27, 1993, in Milan. A car packed with explosives was detonated on Via Palestro, near the Padiglione d'Arte Contemporanea, killing 5 people and injuring dozens. These were not targeted assassinations. They were acts of pure terrorism designed to destabilize the nation and terrorize the populace. Simultaneously, the judicial world was again plunged into mourning when a magistrate in Rome, Paolo Borsellino's close friend and colleague, was assassinated. The state's response was a new, massive wave of arrests and a deepening of the investigations that now began to follow a tantalizing and dangerous new lead. The testimonies of the growing number of pentiti, combined with wiretaps and financial investigations, began to point towards a revelation that was perhaps even more disturbing than the terrorist bombs. The possibility that Salvatore Riina and his Corleonesi had not been operating in a vacuum, but had cultivated secret, high-level connections within the Italian political establishment. The most prominent name to emerge was that of Giulio Andreotti, a 7-time Prime Minister of Italy and a towering, almost mythical figure in the country's post-war politics. The pentiti, primarily Baldassare di Maggio and others, alleged that Andreotti had personally paid homage to Riina at a secret meeting in the 1980s, a ritual acknowledgement of the mafia boss's power. They claimed that this was not an isolated incident, but part of a long-standing, mutually beneficial relationship between Andreotti's powerful Christian Democratic Party and Cosa Nostra, an exchange of votes for protection and favorable government contracts. For many Italians, this was the ultimate betrayal, suggesting that the cancer of the mafia had metastasized into the very heart of the state. Andreotti was put on trial, facing charges of association with the mafia. The trial became a national spectacle, a dramatic courtroom battle that forced the country to confront its darkest suspicions about the intertwining of politics and organized crime. While Andreotti was ultimately acquitted of the most serious charges on appeal, the case left a permanent stain on his legacy and confirmed in the public mind that the relationship between the mafia and certain segments of the political world had been far too cozy for far too long. This period following Riina's capture was therefore a paradoxical time. It was an era of great victory for the state, but also one of profound disillusionment, revealing that the enemy was not just a criminal organization in Sicily, but a network of corruption that reached into the highest echelons of power in Rome. The war was not over. It had simply moved from the streets of Palermo to the courtrooms and the halls of government. And the man at the center of it all, Salvatore Riina, was now preparing for his final role, that of a defendant, facing the consequences of a life built on murder from the sterile, controlled environment of a prison cell. The final phase of Salvatore Riina's life, the long years of imprisonment and trial, was a protracted and bitter battle, fought not with Lupara shotguns and car bombs, but with legal motions, stony silences, and a continued, unyielding defiance that defined his character until his very last breath. Upon his capture, he was subjected to the harsh 41 bis prison regime, a measure specifically designed for the most dangerous mafiosi, which isolated him from all contact with other prisoners. Severely restricted family visits, which were conducted through glass barriers with monitored communication, and cut him off from any ability to manage his criminal empire. For a man who had wielded absolute power from the shadows for over 2 decades, this was a profound and humiliating defeat, a life reduced to the confines of a concrete cell, under constant surveillance, with no power beyond his own thoughts. Yet, even in this sterile environment, Riina refused to bow or show any sign of remorse. He became a symbol of unrepentant evil, a living monument to the Mafia's code of silence and defiance. His multiple trials for the murders of Falcone, Borsellino, the countless victims of the Second Mafia War, and many other crimes, became theatrical stages for his contempt. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was to dismiss the court's authority, to deny any knowledge of the crimes, or to utter cryptic, threatening phrases. He never acknowledged the legitimacy of the Italian state, viewing the judges and prosecutors not as dispensers of justice, but as enemy combatants in a war he was still fighting. One of his most infamous statements, delivered with a cold stare, was, "I am not a mafioso, I am a farmer." This was not a plea of innocence, but a profound insult, a refusal to even engage with the charges on the state's terms. He maintained this posture of stoic, arrogant denial through countless hours of testimony from pentiti, through the presentation of forensic evidence, and through the heart-wrenching accounts of victims' families. He was confronted in court by the widows of the police officers killed with Borsellino. He looked at them without a flicker of emotion, offering no apology, no acknowledgement of their pain. This was the ultimate expression of his life's philosophy. Sentimentality was weakness, and any admission, even one of basic human empathy, would be a betrayal of the brutal world he had built and ruled. The convictions piled up, one life sentence after another, until it became a mere formality. He was found guilty and sentenced to over 24 life sentences, a numerical expression of his monstrous legacy that was as abstract as it was meaningless, for he would never walk free again. His life in prison was a routine of stark simplicity, a far cry from the power and luxury he had once commanded. Yet, Even from his cell, he remained a potent, symbolic figure. He became a point of reference for a new generation of mafiosi, a hardliner who had chosen all-out war over negotiation, a path that some still revered. His family, particularly his wife, Antonietta Bagarella, and his children, became his link to the outside world, and they too were embroiled in the legal battles, with his sons eventually being convicted for mafia association themselves, a testament to the Riina family's deep and enduring commitment to the criminal organization. As the years turned into decades, his health inevitably began to fail. The once stocky and formidable beast grew frail, suffering from kidney disease, Parkinson's disease, and other ailments of old age. He was moved to a prison hospital wing, a dying king in a medicalized cage. The Italian state, bound by its own laws and principles, provided him with medical care, dialysis treatments, and all the necessities to keep him alive, a stark contrast to the summary executions he had so freely ordered. This period was a quiet, slow motion epilogue to a life of explosive violence. There were no more dramatic escapes, no more shocking revelations, just the slow, inexorable winding down of a biological clock. He became a ghost in the system, a name from a past era of terror, remembered but increasingly distant. He lived long enough to see the mafia transform, to see new bosses emerge who adopted lower profiles and focused on business and international trafficking. Bosses who had learned from his catastrophic mistake of directly challenging the state. He lived to see his own legacy debated, a symbol of both the peak of mafia power and the folly of its most arrogant excesses. On November 17, 2017, at the age of 87, Salvatore Riina died in the prison hospital ward of the Opera prison in Milan. His death was as quiet and clinical as his life had been loud and brutal. There was no national outpouring of grief from the criminal underworld, no grand funeral, the state. Fearing his grave could become a shrine, arranged for a private, anonymous burial in his hometown of Corleone, a final attempt to erase the myth and consign the man to the dust of history. In death, as in life, he remained a figure of division and dark fascination, a subject of endless analysis, but very little understanding. For to understand Riina would be to stare into an abyss of human nature, where conscience had been utterly extinguished and replaced by a will to power so absolute it ultimately consumed itself. To understand the monstrous entity that Salvatore Riina became, one must venture beyond the chronology of his crimes and delve into the twisted psychological and philosophical landscape that governed his every action. A worldview so stark and brutal, it almost defies comprehension. At the core of his being was not a complex ideology, but a simple, primal conviction the world was a jungle, and in a jungle, only the most ruthless predator survives. This was not a metaphor for Riina, it was a literal, operational truth. His childhood in the poverty-stricken, feudal environment of Corleone had burned this lesson into his soul long before he ever swore a mafia oath. He saw that the state offered no protection, that the law was a tool for the powerful, and that the church preached a passivity that led only to continued subjugation. Therefore, the only rational response was to embrace the law of the jungle completely, to become its ultimate embodiment. This foundational belief system eradicated any potential for empathy or remorse. Human beings were not individuals with intrinsic worth. They were either assets to be used, obstacles to be removed, or subjects to be ruled. The murder of a rival, a witness, a judge, or an innocent bystander was, in his calculus, no different than a farmer culling a diseased animal. A necessary, pragmatic action to maintain the health and security of his domain. This is why he could order the deaths of children, like the young son of Salvatore Riina, without a second thought. It was not an act of sadism for its own sake, though sadism was certainly present. It was a strategic move to eliminate a future threat, to prune a family tree before it could grow back. This utter dehumanization of his victims was his greatest psychological strength and the source of his terrifying effectiveness. It allowed him to make decisions with a cold, dispassionate logic that more emotionally complex rivals could not match. Furthermore, Riina possessed an almost preternatural understanding of the uses of violence. For him, violence was not merely a means to an end, it was a language, a form of communication. A single, spectacularly brutal murder could convey a message more potent than any treaty or negotiation. The severed arm of Inzerillo, the hundreds of bullets used on Navarra, the dissolution of bodies in acid. These were not just killings, they were statements written in blood. They were designed to paralyze his enemies with fear, to demonstrate his absolute lack of restraint, and to establish a legend of invincibility that would precede him into every room and every negotiation. This reputation became a weapon in itself, often allowing him to achieve his goals without firing a shot, as the mere threat of his involvement was enough to compel obedience. His leadership style was not one of charisma in the traditional sense, but of sheer, overwhelming dominance. He ruled through a combination of terror and a perverted sense of loyalty. Those who served him faithfully were rewarded with power and wealth within his organization. Those who questioned him wavered, or even appeared to waver, were exterminated. This created a self-perpetuating cycle of violence. As the only people who survived and thrived in his inner circle were those who were as ruthless and unyielding as he was. Men like Bernardo Provenzano and Leoluca Bagarella, who mirrored his own pathological traits. His famous statement, "I am a farmer," when asked if he was a mafioso, is a key to understanding this psychology. It was not just a denial, it was a reflection of his self-image. He saw himself as a cultivator, a man who tended to his garden. The garden was his criminal empire, and his tools were intimidation, corruption, and murder. He was weeding, planting, and harvesting, using methods that were harsh, but, in his mind, necessary for a successful yield. This mindset also explains his fatal miscalculation with the state. He did not see the Italian government as a legitimate sovereign entity with a social contract and the backing of its people. He saw it as just another rival gang, a larger, more bureaucratic Cosca. He believed that if he hit this rival gang hard enough, with enough shocking force, as he had with the Bontade and Inzerillo families, it would eventually sue for peace, negotiate, and cede territory and authority to him. The bombings of Falcone, Borsellino, and the mainland were, in his mind, not acts of terrorism against a nation, but tactical strikes in a corporate war against a competing syndicate. This profound failure to understand the nature of a democratic state, its resilience, and the power of public outrage was the critical flaw in his strategic genius. He was a master of the jungle, but he did not understand the city. He could comprehend and defeat other predators, but he could not comprehend the collective will of a civilized society that, once finally awakened, would mobilize all its resources to hunt him down. In the end, the psychology of Salvatore Riina was a closed, self-referential system, a perfect engine of destruction that was ultimately incapable of adapting to a world that operated on principles beyond its own brutal, simplistic logic. The reign of Salvatore Riina, while defined by its unparalleled violence, was also a period of profound economic transformation for Cosa Nostra, a period where the organization under his command evolved from a largely regional, extortion-based entity into a sophisticated, multinational financial conglomerate with tentacles reaching deep into the legitimate economy. Riina understood, with the instincts of a ruthless capitalist, that terror was not an end in itself, but the primary tool for securing and expanding market share. The massive wealth accumulated by the Corleonesi during the 1980s and early 1990s was the true engine of his power, funding his war chest, buying silence, and corrupting public officials. The most significant source of this wealth was the heroin trade. While the Palermo families like the Bontades and Inzerillos had pioneered the Pisa connection, smuggling heroin into the United States with the help of their American cousins, Riina's Corleonesi, after exterminating these rivals, seized control of this incredibly lucrative pipeline. The profits were astronomical, generating hundreds of millions, if not billions, of dollars. This river of cash needed to be laundered and reinvested, and this is where Riina's organization demonstrated a remarkable, if sinister, entrepreneurial flexibility. They moved aggressively into the world of public works and construction, a sector booming with government investment in Sicily and across southern Italy. Through their now standard methods of intimidation, the murder of recalcitrant engineers, the bombing of construction sites that refused to pay, the threatening of public officials, they ensured that no significant contract was awarded without their approval. Their companies, or companies forced to pay them a heavy pizzo, won the bids to build roads, hospitals, and public housing. They controlled the supply of essential materials like concrete and sand, creating monopolies and inflating costs, siphoning off vast sums of public money. This systematic looting of state funds served a dual purpose. It generated enormous profits, and it deeply corrupted the political and administrative class, creating a network of dependents and accomplices who had a vested interest in looking the other way. But their financial empire did not stop at construction. With their capital, they bought into banks, hotels, supermarkets, and agricultural enterprises. They invested in the financial markets, using complicit brokers to move money and manipulate stocks. They became silent partners in countless legitimate businesses, their illicit capital providing a competitive edge that honest entrepreneurs could not match. This process of money laundering was essential, not just for enjoying the spoils of crime, but for protecting those spoils. It transformed dirty money from drug trafficking and extortion into clean assets, a palatial villa, a fleet of luxury cars, a portfolio of stocks and bonds that could be displayed and passed on to their children. Riina himself, despite his austere personal demeanor, oversaw this vast financial network, understanding that economic power was as important as military power for long-term dominance. He used this wealth to create a state within a state. The mafia under Riina provided services that the official state often failed to deliver in Sicily. It offered loans to struggling businesses at exorbitant rates enforced by violence. It settled disputes with finality, and it provided a form of social welfare to the families of imprisoned mafiosi, ensuring their loyalty. This created a perverse sense of dependency and legitimacy within certain segments of the population, who saw the mafia not as a predator, but as a necessary, if harsh, part of the social fabric. This economic dominion also funded his war against the state. The sophisticated remote, controlled bombs used to kill Falcone and Borsellino, the vast arsenals of weapons, the safe houses, and the complex logistics of his fugitive life all required a steady, massive flow of cash. The same financial networks that laundered drug money were used to pay his hitmen, bribe prison guards, and support his family in luxury while he was in hiding. When the state finally captured him and began to focus on asset seizure, the true scale of his wealth began to emerge, though much of it remains hidden to this day, buried in a maze of shell companies and offshore accounts. The economic legacy of Riina's reign is a lasting one. He demonstrated to the mafia that the future lay not in rustic banditry, but in global finance and the systemic corruption of public institutions. He turned Cosa Nostra into a modern criminal corporation that used murder as a business strategy. This lesson was learned well by his successors, like Bernardo Provenzano, who, while adopting a lower profile, continued to focus on infiltrating the economy, proving that the most enduring damage inflicted by the beast of Corleone may not be the graves he filled, but the corrosive way he and his organization intertwined their criminal interests with the very economic and political foundations of his country. A poison that continues to require vigilant antidotes generations later. The capture and imprisonment of Salvatore Riina did not create a power vacuum so much as it forced a strategic evolution within Cosa Nostra, a transition from the era of spectacular, declarative violence to an era of quiet, insidious infiltration, a shift embodied by the man who had been his most trusted partner and who would eventually succeed him, Bernardo Provenzano. For decades, Provenzano had operated as the perfect counterpart to Riina's fiery brutality. Where Riina was the public face of terror, the beast, whose name was whispered in fear, Provenzano was the accountant, or the tractor, a man of immense patience, secrecy, and bureaucratic cunning. He was the master of the pizzini, the tiny, cryptic slips of paper that formed the nervous system of their clandestine empire, and he shared Riina's fugitive status for over 40 years, becoming a ghost even more elusive than his boss, while Riina waged his all-out war on the state. It is widely believed that Provenzano had deep reservations about this strategy, seeing it as a dangerous provocation that would ultimately lead to their downfall. He represented a different school of thought within the Mafia, one that believed power was best exercised not through headlines and car bombs, but through silence, corruption, and the slow, steady accumulation of economic influence. With Riina permanently caged in 1993, the path was clear for Provenzano to implement his vision and begin the process of rebuilding Cosa Nostra from the ashes of Riina's war. His first and most crucial task was to halt the bleeding. The state's retaliatory crackdown had been devastating, with thousands of arrests and a demoralized rank and file. Provenzano's strategy was one of strategic retreat and consolidation. He issued orders disseminated through his famous pizzini for the organization to lower its profile, to avoid flashy murders, and to focus on business. The goal was to convince the state and the public that the mafia was a spent force, a problem of the past, allowing them to operate with less scrutiny. This, Pax Mafiosa, was not a sign of weakness, but a calculated move for long-term survival. Under his leadership, the mafia became less of a military organization and more of a holding company. The core businesses of extortion, public works fraud, and drug trafficking continued, but with a greater emphasis on financial sophistication and international connections. Provenzano focused on deepening the mafia's infiltration of the legitimate economy, investing their massive illicit profits into businesses across Europe, and strengthening their political connections through bribery and the exchange of votes for favors, all while maintaining an image of public quiet. This period saw a dramatic decrease in high-profile mafia murders in Sicily, which many mistakenly interpreted as the defeat of Cosa Nostra. In reality, it was simply hibernating, healing its wounds, and accumulating power in a less visible, but potentially more dangerous, form. Provenzano understood that in the modern world, a politician on your payroll was far more valuable than a dead judge on the front page. A corrupted banker could move millions with a keystroke, something no hitman could ever accomplish. This shift required a different type of mafioso, not the fiery, tempered killer, but the patient, calculating businessman who could wear a suit, read a balance sheet, and negotiate with politicians and international partners. Provenzano's reign, which lasted until his own capture in a small farmhouse near Corleone in 2006, was a testament to the resilience and adaptability of the organization Riina had centralized. He proved that the mafia could survive and even thrive after the fall of its most iconic and brutal leader. He managed the corporation, ensuring its financial health and its continued relevance, all while remaining one of the most wanted men in the world. The fact that he was able to evade capture for so long, living for years in the Sicilian countryside, was a humbling reminder to the state that the enemy was not just a single man, but a deeply embedded social and economic system. The transition from Riina to Provenzano marks a critical chapter in the history of organized crime. The moment the Mafia learned that in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the most effective form of dominance was not to declare war on the state, but to become an inseparable, invisible part of its fabric, a silent partner in the economy, and a ghost in the halls of power, a lesson that continues to define the global threat of organized crime to this very day. The story of Salvatore Riina is inextricably linked to the small, rugged town of Corleone, a place that is less a geographical location and more a state of mind, a crucible that forged a unique and terrifying criminal ethos. To understand Riina, one must understand Corleone, for the man and the town are mirror images of each other, each shaping the other's destiny in a relentless feedback loop of poverty, pride, and violence. Nestled inland, away from the cosmopolitan influences of Palermo, Corleone was for centuries a place of feudal hardship, where a class of landless peasants labored under the thumb of absentee landlords and their enforcers, the Gabalotti. This environment bred a deep-seated distrust of all external authority, be it the state, the church, or the northern Italian industrialist. The only law that mattered was the law of survival, and the only justice was the justice one could take for oneself. This is the fertile ground in which the original Mafia, the Cosci, took root, not as a purely criminal organization, but as a parallel system of power that provided a rough, brutal form of order and, for a select few, a path out of abject destitution. The Corleonese Mafia developed a reputation for being particularly harsh, insular, and uncompromising, even by the savage standards of Cosa Nostra. They were considered peasants, hillbillies, by the more sophisticated Palermo families, a slight that would fester in the hearts of men like Luciano Leggio and Salvatore Riina and fuel their vengeful rise. For Riina, Corleone was not just his hometown, it was his fortress, his recruiting ground, and his ideological touchstone. He trusted only Corleonese men, bound by the shared experience of this harsh upbringing. His inner circle, the core of the Corleonesi faction that would conquer all of Cosa Nostra, was a tight, knit clan of relatives and childhood friends from the same few streets. This parochialism was his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. It created an unbreakable bond of loyalty among his followers, a bond sealed in blood, and a shared sense of historical grievance. But it also limited his vision, reinforcing his belief that the world was divided into us, the people of Corleone, and them, everyone else, to be used, deceived, or destroyed. The town itself became a company town for the Mafia. While Riina was in hiding, he never truly left Corleone. His influence permeated every aspect of life there. Businesses paid him pizzo. Local politicians did his bidding, and the townspeople, a mixture of fear, complicity, and a warped sense of local pride, maintained the wall of silence, the omerta, that protected him. He was their most famous son, a perverse Robin Hood figure who had defied the distant, contemptuous powers in Rome and Palermo and had made the name Corleone, once synonymous with poverty, synonymous with power. Even after his capture, this dynamic persisted. The capture of Bernardo Provenzano in 2006 in a farmhouse mere kilometers from the town center, after over 40 years as a fugitive, was a stark demonstration of this fact. He had not been hiding in the Amazon rainforest. He had been hiding in plain sight, sheltered by the active and passive support of his community. The legacy for the town itself is complex and painful. The name Corleone is now globally recognized, largely thanks to Mario Puzo's The Godfather. But it is a cursed fame, a brand forever associated with organized crime. The town has made efforts to rebrand itself, promoting its beautiful landscapes and its anti-mafia documentation center, but the shadow of Riina, Leggio, and Provenzano is long and dark. It is a place grappling with a profound identity crisis, caught between the desire to move into a lawful future and the inescapable pull of a brutal past. For decades, the economy of the town was, in part, a mafia economy, and untangling that web is a generational task. The story of Corleone is the essential backdrop to the story of Salvatore Riina. It explains his resilience, his ruthlessness, and his ultimate inability to see a world beyond the codes of the society that produced him. He was the ultimate product of his environment, a human weapon forged in the hills of his hometown, a man who took the specific, localized lessons of Corleone: distrust the state, value loyalty above all, and use absolute violence to achieve absolute power, and applied them on a national stage with devastating consequences. He was, in the most literal and terrifying sense, a man of his place. A critical and often overlooked aspect of Salvatore Riina's reign of terror was the central, indispensable role played by the network of women in his life, who existed in the complex intersection of traditional Sicilian family values and the brutal, clandestine demands of the mafia. To view these women merely as passive bystanders or ignorant housewives is to misunderstand the very ecosystem that allowed a fugitive like Riina to survive for nearly a quarter of a century. The most prominent of these figures was his wife, Antonietta Bagarella, a woman born into the mafia aristocracy of Corleone, the sister of his trusted lieutenant, Leoluca Bagarella. Her marriage to Riina in 1974 was a strategic alliance, solidifying his power base within the most formidable criminal clans of the town. But Antonietta was far more than a political pawn. She was an active and crucial operative in his secret empire. As the wife of the most wanted man in Italy, her life was a perpetual performance of normalcy layered over a foundation of immense risk and complicity. She was his primary link to the outside world, the trusted conduit who managed his communications, relayed his orders, and provided the logistical support necessary for his life in hiding. She moved between safe houses, delivered messages, and handled money, all while raising their children and maintaining the appearance of a single mother, a cover that allowed her a degree of mobility and lowered suspicion. Her knowledge of his activities was comprehensive. She was not shielded from the truth, but was an integral part of its machinery. The Riina household, therefore, was not a sanctuary from his criminal life. It was its command and control center, with Antonietta as its chief of staff, This role required a steel, like nerve, a deep understanding of the codes of Omert, and an unwavering loyalty that transcended mere wifely duty. It was the loyalty of a soldier to her commander and her cause. Beyond Antonietta, there was a wider circle of female relatives, mothers, sisters, aunts, and cousins, who formed a protective human shield around the fugitive boss. They provided safe houses, cooked meals, delivered laundry, and acted as couriers, their mundane domestic activities providing the perfect camouflage for a vast criminal conspiracy. These women were the guardians of the secret world, their homes becoming rotating prisons for men who were kings in the shadows, but prisoners of their own notoriety. They lived with the constant fear of police raids, the trauma of sudden, violent loss, and the psychological burden of knowing the gruesome details of their husbands' and sons' work. Yet, within the context of their culture and their circumstances, many of them saw this not as a burden, but as a duty. They were upholding the family honor as defined by their society, an honor inextricably linked to the power and prestige of the mafia. They raised their sons to venerate their fugitive fathers, to see them as heroes fighting a just war against a hostile state, thus ensuring the intergenerational transfer of mafia values. The children of Salvatore Riina, Giovanni, Giuseppe, and Lucia grew up in this environment, knowing their father was a powerful and feared man, yet only being able to visit him in fleeting, clandestine encounters. They were taught a version of reality, where their father was a persecuted freedom fighter, a narrative that would have profound consequences. Both of Riina's sons would later follow him into a life of crime, being convicted for mafia association, a testament to the powerful indoctrination and the inescapable pull of the family business. The role of these women creates a profound moral dilemma. Were they victims, trapped in a system they did not create, or were they willing accomplices, active architects of their own oppression and enablers of mass murder? The truth, as it often is, lies in a painful gray area. They were products of a patriarchal, closed society that offered them few alternatives. Their identity and social status were entirely derived from the men they were connected to. To betray those men was to betray their family, their community, and their very reason for being. Yet, their active participation was essential. Without the network of women maintaining the fabric of daily life and providing a veil of normality, the long-term fugitivity of men like Riina and Provenzano would have been impossible. The state eventually recognized this, and in the years following Riina's capture, prosecutors began to target these female networks more aggressively, charging wives and mothers with mafia association for their supporting roles. The story of the women in Riina's world is a dark, fascinating, and essential chapter in the saga of Cosa Nostra, revealing that the organization's strength did not lie solely in the hands of its gunmen, but in the silent, resilient, and complicit strength of its families, where the domestic sphere was not a retreat from crime, but its most vital and protected operational headquarters. The downfall of Salvatore Riina, while precipitated by the courageous collaboration of a few key pentiti, was ultimately the result of a slow, methodical, and technological revolution within the Italian state's anti-mafia apparatus. A quiet war fought in laboratories, financial databases, and surveillance vans that finally matched the mafia's own patience and secrecy. For decades, the state's approach had been reactive, often hampered by corruption, a lack of resources, and a fundamental misunderstanding of Cosa Nostra as a disjointed criminal phenomenon rather than a hierarchical corporation. The Maxi trial of the mid-1980s was the first great breakthrough, proving that the mafia could be fought systematically using the testimonies of insiders like Tommaso Bassetta. But Riina's response, the murders of Falcone and Borsellino, was a brutal demonstration that the state was still losing the intelligence war. The shock of those assassinations, however, became the catalyst for a profound and permanent transformation. The first major change was a philosophical one, the adoption of a financial and electronic strategy. Investigators realized that following the money trail was often more effective than following the blood trail. The Corleoneses' massive profits from heroin and extortion had to be laundered, invested, and spent. Teams of financial police and forensic accountants began to meticulously trace the flow of capital through a labyrinth of shell companies, front businesses, and bank accounts, both in Italy and abroad. They started to map the economic footprint of the organization, identifying assets for seizure and uncovering patterns that pointed back to the hidden leadership. This financial scrutiny was a silent, relentless pressure that slowly constricted the organization's ability to operate freely. Simultaneously, technological advancements provided a decisive edge. The widespread and sophisticated use of electronic surveillance became the state's most powerful weapon. Instead of relying solely on the dangerous and unpredictable testimony of pentiti, investigators could now listen in real time. They placed hidden microphones in mafia meeting places, in cars, and even in the homes of suspected mafia associates. They deployed tens of thousands of hours of wiretaps on telephones, capturing the casual, unguarded conversations that revealed hierarchies, plans, and personalities. This electronic blanket provided a context and verification for the testimonies of collaborators, creating an irrefutable web of evidence that could not be dismissed as the vengeful lies of a turncoat. The investigation that led directly to Riina's capture, led by the Carabinieri's Special Operations Group under General Giovanni Di Gennaro and Colonel Sergio Di Caprio, was a masterpiece of this new, patient, intelligence-driven approach. They did not search for Riina himself. They focused on his protective shell, the handful of drivers and couriers he trusted. They identified Baldassare Di Maggio, and through a combination of physical surveillance and electronic monitoring, they patiently tracked his movements, building a pattern of life that they correctly deduced would eventually lead them to the boss. This operation required immense discipline and resources, a stark contrast to the often chaotic police responses of the past. The legal framework had also evolved to support these new methods. Laws were strengthened to protect pentiti and their families, offering them a genuine chance at a new life. which encouraged more high-level defections. The 41 bis prison regime, which isolated captured bosses, was crucial in preventing them from continuing to lead their organizations from behind bars, effectively neutering Riina the moment he was captured. Furthermore, the creation of a national anti-mafia directorate, inspired by the model of Falcone and Borsellino's pooled investigative work, ensured better coordination and information sharing between different police forces and prosecutors' offices, breaking down the bureaucratic silos that the mafia had long exploited. The public sentiment, too, had irrevocably shifted. The sight of soldiers on the streets of Sicily and the national mourning for the slain magistrates created a social and political environment where failure was no longer an option. The state was finally willing to devote the vast financial and human capital required to win this war. The capture of Riina was therefore not a lucky break. It was the inevitable culmination of this multi-faceted, modernized, and relentless campaign. It represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power. The state had finally learned to fight the mafia on its own terms, with patience, with secrecy, and with an overwhelming concentration of resources, while leveraging tools of finance and technology that the criminal organization could not match. It was the victory of a systematic, intelligent, and democratic persistence over archaic and brutal tyranny, a lesson that would be applied again in the eventual capture of Bernardo Provenzano and other mafia bosses, proving that no criminal, no matter how powerful or clever, is truly invisible to a determined and modern state. The legacy of Salvatore Riina is a dark and complex stain on the fabric of Italian history, a subject of endless analysis, debate, and horror, whose repercussions extend far beyond the grim tally of his victims and the lengthy court transcripts of his trials. To assess his legacy is to confront a series of profound and unsettling questions about power, evil, and the resilience of democratic institutions. On the most immediate level, his legacy is one of pure, unadulterated trauma. He left behind a nation scarred by grief, with hundreds of families forever broken by his murderous commands. The deaths of Giovanni Falcone, Paolo Borsellino, and their bodyguards were not just personal tragedies. They were attacks on the soul of the Italian state, wounds that, while healed on the surface, still ache in the national consciousness. He demonstrated the terrifying vulnerability of a democracy to a determined, ruthless enemy operating from within, forcing the country to confront its own weaknesses, its corruption, and its periods of tragic indifference. Yet, paradoxically, his most destructive acts also became the catalyst for the state's greatest strength. The sheer, shocking brutality of the Capi and Via d'Amelio bombings finally galvanized a collective will to fight that had previously been fragmented and inconsistent. In this sense, Riina's war ultimately backfired. He created the very monster that would destroy him, unifying and strengthening the anti-mafia movement in a way that decades of low-level crime never could. His legacy, therefore, is also one of a painful national rebirth, a hardening of resolve that led to the creation of more robust legal instruments, more sophisticated police methods, and a public that became less tolerant of mafia influence in politics and business. Within the world of Cosa Nostra itself, his legacy is deeply ambiguous. He is still revered by a hardline faction as the ultimate homo donor, the boss who dared to challenge the state directly, a figure of fearsome purity in his application of violence. For them, he represents a peak of mafia power and prestige, a time when the organization commanded not just fear, but a form of dark respect. Yet, for many other mafiosi, particularly those of a more pragmatic and business-oriented bent, Riina is a cautionary tale, a symbol of catastrophic strategic overreach. His all-out war is seen as a historic mistake that brought down upon Cosa Nostra a level of state repression from which it never fully recovered, forcing it into a lower, less flamboyant profile and disrupting its lucrative business operations for years. His successor, Bernardo Provenzano, spent much of his reign effectively repudiating Riina's methods, focusing on quiet infiltration over loud confrontation. In this view, Riina's legacy is one of hubris and downfall, a lesson in the limits of brute force. On a global scale, Riina became the archetype of the modern crime lord, a figure whose notoriety transcended national borders. His story influenced how the world perceives organized crime, moving the image away from the romanticized, ceremonial godfather and toward the reality of the psychopathic, corporatized killer. He demonstrated the potential for organized crime to evolve into a terrorist entity, willing to use indiscriminate violence to achieve political and economic goals. His model of using extreme violence to centralize power and discipline a criminal organization has been studied and, in some cases, emulated by cartels and syndicates around the world. Furthermore, his life forces an uncomfortable sociological examination of the link between poverty, marginalization, and crime. While his actions can never be excused, his origins in the desperate, feudal poverty of rural Sicily provide a crucial context. He was a product of a system that failed him, and he in turn built a monstrous alternative system that failed thousands of others. His story is a stark reminder that when the state is absent, corrupt, or perceived as an enemy, it creates a vacuum that darker forces will inevitably fill. Finally, on a human level, the legacy of Salvatore Riina is the enduring mystery of a man who seemed to operate without a moral compass. His utter lack of remorse, his cold-eyed defiance in court, and his ability to order the deaths of children and national heroes with the same dispassionate efficiency as a business transaction places him in a category of criminal that fascinates and horrifies in equal measure. He remains a dark enigma, a man who embodied the banality of evil in his domestic life and the extremity of evil in his professional one. His death in prison did not provide closure or answers. It simply closed the final chapter of a life that serves as a permanent, grim lesson on the absolute corruption that absolute power can bring, and the terrifying capacity for violence that lies dormant in the human spirit, waiting for the right, or rather the wrong, conditions to be unleashed. The physical and psychological world of a fugitive Salvatore Riina was a landscape of stark contrasts, a life of immense power wielded from within the confines of a self-imposed prison, a paradox that defined his existence for nearly 24 years. To envision his daily life is to strip away the Hollywood glamour of the gangster on the run and replace it with a far more mundane, yet equally terrifying, reality of relentless paranoia, stifling routine, and profound isolation. His various safe houses, scattered around Palermo and the countryside, were not luxurious hideouts but functional, anonymous apartments chosen for their tactical advantages, clear lines of sight, multiple escape routes, and unassuming appearances. Within these walls, the man who commanded an army lived a life of severe austerity. His power was entirely abstract, existing in the messages he sent and the fear his name invoked in person. He was a prisoner of his own notoriety, unable to feel the sun on his face without a calculated risk, unable to walk into a cafe or converse with anyone outside his minuscule circle of trust. His entire existence was meticulously choreographed to avoid the Carabinieri's dragnet. Movements were planned days in advance, using a complex system of coded messages and lookouts. A simple meeting with one of his lieutenants was a major logistical operation involving decoy cars, switched vehicles, and layers of security. Trust was his most precious and rarest commodity, and it was doled out in minuscule amounts, reserved for a handful of fellow Corleonesi like Bernardo Provenzano and his own brother-in-law, Leluca Bagarella. Even within this inner circle, the threat of betrayal was a constant, gnawing presence. Riina's own rise to power had been built on the betrayal of his predecessors, and he knew the same fate could easily befall him. This constant state of high alert, of viewing every unexpected sound or slight change in routine as a potential death sentence, must have exerted an unimaginable psychological toll, hardening him further and eroding any last vestiges of normal human connection. His only window to the outside world, beyond the grim reports of his underlings, was television and the carefully filtered information brought to him by his wife, Antonietta. He would have watched the news reports of his own crimes, seen the faces of the magistrates he had ordered killed, observed the public outrage and the funerals, all from the detached, sterile perspective of a spectator, further reinforcing his worldview that the world outside was a stage on which he was the unseen director. His family life was a painful parody of normality. His children knew him as a phantom figure, a father who appeared in fleeting, secretive visits, a man they could not speak of to their friends, whose true profession was a dark family secret. He missed their school events, their birthdays, their daily lives, a sacrifice on the altar of his own power. Yet, within this prison of his own making, he exercised absolute authority. His word was law and a single command, whispered in a safe house or scribbled on a pizzino, could set in motion events that would ripple across Italy, determining life and death, shifting markets, and terrorizing the nation. This dichotomy, the caged bird who could still summon storms, must have been a source of immense psychological power for him, a confirmation of his own exceptionalism. He was not like other men. His influence was so vast it could not be contained by walls. His daily routine was likely one of extreme discipline, early rising, a simple meal, long hours receiving reports, giving orders and planning strategy, interspersed with periods of utter boredom and waiting. It was a life devoid of spontaneity, joy, or leisure, a monastic existence dedicated solely to the maintenance and expansion of power. The psychological portrait that emerges is not of a flamboyant king of crime, but of a severe, focused, and profoundly damaged individual, a man who had traded his humanity for dominion, and who, in the silent hours of the night, in his anonymous apartment, could truly believe the trade had been worth it. This was the world of the Ghost of Sicily, a world where the most powerful man in the criminal underworld was also its most confined prisoner, a testament to the fact that the pursuit of absolute power does not liberate the pursuer. It builds the walls of their final, inescapable cell around them, even before the state arrives to lock the door. The long and tortuous legal journey that followed Salvatore Riina's capture was an unprecedented chapter in Italian jurisprudence, a sprawling, multi-decade series of trials that sought, with painstaking effort, to hold the beast of Corleone accountable for a fraction of the immense suffering he had caused. These courtrooms became the final battleground between the state he had defied and the man who refused to recognize its authority. Riina's strategy in court was a masterclass in minimalist defiance. He did not mount elaborate legal defenses or attempt to justify his actions. Instead, he adopted a posture of complete non-cooperation and contempt. He remained largely silent, often refusing to even answer the judge's questions, or offering only curt, dismissive replies. When he did speak, it was to deny any knowledge of the crimes, to claim he was a simple farmer persecuted by the state, or to utter chillingly ambiguous statements that were interpreted as veiled threats. He never showed a flicker of emotion when confronted with the grieving families of his victims, nor when presented with gruesome photographic evidence of his handiwork. This stoic, remorseless facade was, in its own way, as terrifying as his violent acts. It was a performance designed to communicate one simple message: your laws do not apply to me, your court has no power over me, and I do not recognize your right to judge me. This forced the trials to proceed largely without his participation, based on the mountain of evidence painstakingly assembled by the prosecutors. The detailed, often heartbreaking testimonies of the pentiti like Busetta, Contorno, and D.I. Maggio, thousands of pages of wiretap transcripts, financial records, and forensic reports. The prosecutors, men and women who worked under armed guard, faced the daunting task of narrating a saga of criminality so vast and complex it seemed to defy comprehension. They had to connect the dots between a murder of a rival in a dusty Corleone field in the 1950s to the car bomb that tore apart a highway in Capi in 1992, proving it was all part of a single, continuous criminal enterprise led by the same man. The convictions came, one after another. He was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment for the murders of Falcone and Borsellino, for the massacre of Via d'Amelio, for the countless victims of the Second Mafia War, and for a litany of other crimes. Each new life sentence was a symbolic victory for the state, a line item on the balance sheet of justice, but they seemed to have no discernible impact on Riina himself. He absorbed the verdicts with the same impassive stare, as if they were irrelevant pronouncements from a foreign land. The legal process was also a channel for shocking revelations that continued to emerge even after he was behind bars. Testimonies from new collaborators detailed previously unknown murders and shed further light on the inner workings of his regime. Perhaps the most significant legal development was his trial for the alleged secret negotiations between the state and Cosa Nostra following the bombings of 1993. This trial explored the tantalizing and disturbing possibility that agents of the government, in a state of panic, had engaged in secret talks with mafia intermediaries, a claim that, if true, would have represented a partial, perverse victory for Riina's strategy of terror. While he was ultimately acquitted of these specific charges, the trial further muddied the waters and reinforced the public's perception of a state sometimes willing to compromise with its darkest enemies. Throughout it all, Riina remained in the harsh 41 bis prison regime, a living paradox. The most convicted man in Italian history, yet one who continued to wield a dark symbolic power. His trials were not about discovering his guilt, for that was a foregone conclusion. They were about the state ritually affirming its own authority and providing a form of catharsis, however incomplete, for the nation. They were a public, painstaking accounting of his evil, a process of naming his crimes one by one and assigning them to him officially and for the historical record. It was the bureaucracy of justice slowly, methodically, and relentlessly boxing in a force of nature, proving that while a man may evade the law for a time, a modern democratic state, once fully mobilized, has the patience and the resources to wait him out, to document his sins, and to finally, officially, declare him a monster for all time. The death of Salvatore Riina on November 17, 2017, in a sterile prison hospital ward, was an ending as anticlimactic and shrouded in bureaucratic finality as his life had been dramatic and shrouded in blood-soaked mystery. There was no last stand, no final confession, no deathbed reconciliation with the countless families he had destroyed. His passing was a quiet, biological event, the slow failure of an 87-year-old body worn down by kidney disease, Parkinson's, and the simple, relentless passage of time. The state, which he had fought so violently, now oversaw his end with clinical efficiency, providing the dialysis treatments that prolonged his life even as it kept him in a cage, a stark embodiment of the rule of law he had spent his life denying. The news of his death was met with a complex mixture of emotions across Italy. For the families of his victims, it was a day of profound, if complicated, closure. There was no joy, only a somber acknowledgement that the man who had caused them immeasurable pain could never harm anyone again. Some expressed a bitter disappointment that he had never shown a flicker of remorse, that he had taken the full truth of his crimes, the locations of the Lupara Bianca victims, and the complete extent of his political connections with him, to the grave. For the state and the anti-mafia movement, it was the closing of a dark, defining chapter. The symbol of the mafia's most arrogant and violent era was gone, a confirmation that even the most powerful and elusive criminals are ultimately mortal. Yet, there was no sense of final victory, for the organization he once led, though transformed, continued to exist. His death was a reminder that the fight against organized crime is not a war against individual men, but against a system, a culture, and an economy of illegality that outlives any single boss. Within the world of Cosa Nostra, his death prompted a moment of reflection. For the old guard, the hardened traditionalists, he remained a legendary figure, the ultimate homo d'honneur who had chosen defiance until the very end. For the newer, more business-oriented generation, his passing was perhaps a relief. The final fading of a ghost whose methods and the state's resulting crackdown had made their quieter, more profitable operations more difficult. There were no grand mafia funerals, no public displays of mourning in the underworld. The state, fearing his grave could become a shrine for apologists and admirers, took meticulous steps to prevent it. His body was quietly returned to Corleone, the town that had created him, and that he had, in turn, made infamous. His funeral was a small, private family affair, conducted under heavy police surveillance. He was buried in a simple, unmarked tomb, a deliberate attempt by the authorities to deny him the martyrdom he might have sought. The location was kept secret to avoid it becoming a pilgrimage site. In death, as the state had done in life, it sought to contain him, to minimize his myth, to reduce the beast back to a mere man, to just a body in the ground. The philosophical question his death poses is a profound one. Can true justice ever be served for a man like Riina? The life sentences, the solitary confinement, the national condemnation, were they a sufficient reckoning for a legacy of over 150 murders? For the trauma inflicted upon a nation, for the children left without fathers, for the widows left without husbands? For many, the answer is no. No prison term, no matter how harsh, could ever constitute a true balance for the scale of his evil. His quiet death in a clean bed, attended by state doctors, felt to some like an injustice in itself. Yet, his end also carried a powerful, sobering message about the nature of power and mortality. The man who had sought to make himself a god, a ruler of life and death, was ultimately subdued not by a rival's bullet, but by the frailties of his own human body. His immense power, his fearsome reputation, his vast wealth, none of it could save him from the mundane, universal fate that awaits every human being. His story ends not with a heroic last stand, but with a medical report, a silent family gathering, and an unmarked grave in the town he could never truly leave, a final, fittingly bleak epitaph for a life lived in the deepest shadows, a chilling reminder that the pursuit of power through bloodshed ultimately leads only to dust and silence. The story of Salvatore Riina cannot be confined to the dusty archives of criminal history. It erupts into our present moment, demanding that we extract its lessons. For the forces that created him did not die with him in that prison hospital bed. His life stands as a terrifyingly clear lesson on the consequences of allowing a parallel power to grow unchallenged, on the fragility of democratic institutions in the face of a determined, a moral enemy, and on the dangerous allure of simplistic, violent solutions to complex social problems. The first and most urgent lesson is the absolute necessity of an incorruptible, independent, and well-resourced judiciary. Riina's rise was facilitated by a state that was, for too long, weak, compromised, or willfully blind to the threat in its midst. It was only when magistrates like Falcone and Borsellino were given the tools and the political backing to follow the evidence wherever it led, even into the highest echelons of power, that the state began to fight back effectively. The memory of Riina is a permanent argument for the defense of judicial independence and for the constant vigilance required to protect it from political interference and corruption. The second lesson is about the nature of violence itself. Riina demonstrated that violence, when applied with strategic consistency and utter lack of restraint, can be an astonishingly effective short-term tool for seizing power. It can terrorize populations, eliminate rivals, and create a facade of invincibility. But his story also demonstrates the ultimate futility of a strategy based solely on terror. Violence begets violence, and it creates a vortex that eventually consumes its architect. His war on the state was a catastrophic miscalculation that destroyed his empire and landed him in a cell for the last 24 years of his life. The lesson for any society is that you cannot negotiate with an entity that only understands the language of violence. You must confront it, isolate it, and dismantle it with a force that is both smarter and more principled. The third lesson is economic. Riina's Cosa Nostra was not just a criminal band. It was a predatory corporation that understood how to infiltrate and corrupt the legitimate economy. The fight against modern organized crime is therefore not just a job for the police. It is a job for financial regulators, tax authorities, and antitrust agencies, following the money, seizing assets, and disrupting the flow of capital is as important as arresting hitmen. Riina's legacy reminds us that when crime becomes a business, the state's response must be an economic one as well. The fourth lesson is cultural and social. Riina was a product of a marginalized, impoverished Sicily that felt abandoned by the Italian state. This is not to excuse his crimes, but to understand the environment that produces such monsters. The long-term fight against the mafia and organizations like it requires not only law enforcement, but also social inclusion, economic development, and education. It requires offering young people in marginalized communities a future they can believe in, a legitimate path to respect and prosperity that is more appealing than the dark allure of the mafia's power and wealth. The anti-mafia must be a positive cultural project promoting the values of legality, civic duty, and collective responsibility over the mafia's values of omerta, family, clan loyalty, and individual enrichment through predation. Finally, Riina's life is a lesson in the importance of memory. To forget the horrors he inflicted, to allow the names of Falcone, Borsellino, and his countless other victims to fade from public consciousness. is to risk repeating the mistakes of the past. The memorials, the documentaries, the school curriculums that teach this dark chapter, they are not mere history. They are a vaccine against future infection. They are a reminder of the price that was paid by brave men and women so that the rule of law could prevail over the rule of the jungle. The story of Salvatore Riina is, in the end, a cautionary tale for all modern societies. It shows how quickly a democracy can be undermined from within when it tolerates corruption, ignores social injustice, and underestimates the determination of those who would replace its complex, fragile freedoms with the simple, brutal certainty of the gun. His ghost continues to walk, not through the hills of Corleone, but through the corridors of power and the forgotten neighborhoods of the world, a silent warning of what can happen when a society looks away for too long. And so, we arrive at the end of our journey, a long and shadowed path through the life and times of Salvatore Riina, the ghost of Sicily. From the impoverished, fatherless boy in Corleone to the most feared man in Italy, his story is a dark epic that forces us to stare into the abyss of human potential for evil. We have traced his brutal ascent from a young initiate soaked in the blood of the Matanza di Corleone to the strategic mastermind of the Second Mafia War, who consolidated his power through a genocide of his rivals. We have witnessed his audacious reign, where he transformed Cosa Nostra into a monolithic, terroristic entity, declaring war on the Italian state itself with the car bombs of Capi and Via d'Amelio, murders that shocked the world and forever scarred a nation. We followed his long, fugitive years, a life of power wielded from a prison of his own making, and his ultimate downfall, engineered not by chance, but by the patient, modernized, and relentless machinery of a state finally awakened to the existential threat he posed. We have sat with him in his multiple courtrooms, observing his stony, remorseless defiance through a cascade of life sentences, and we have stood by his unmarked grave in Corleone, where the state sought to bury not just a man, but a dangerous myth. The narrative of Salvatore, Toto, Riina is now complete. But before we part ways with this dark chapter of history, I must offer a final, sincere note. The story you have just experienced was a detailed reconstruction based on court documents, historical records, and the testimonies of those who lived through these events. It was presented with the sole purpose of providing a comprehensive understanding of this complex figure and the devastating impact of organized crime on society. Our aim is always education and reflection through the power of storytelling. If this journey into the heart of darkness has held your attention, if it has provided insight or provoked thought, then I have a simple request for you. Your engagement is what allows us to continue unearthing and presenting these intricate stories from the annals of history and true crime. Please show your support by subscribing to the channel. By hitting that subscribe button and ringing the notification bell, you ensure you won't miss our future deep dives into the stories that have shaped our world, stories of power, corruption, justice, and the human condition in all its facets. Furthermore, if you feel this documentary has value, Share it with others who might find it compelling. Spreading knowledge is how we collectively build a more informed and vigilant world. The story of Salvatore Riina is a stark reminder of why such vigilance is necessary. It is a lesson written in blood and fire, a warning that echoes through time, urging us to cherish and protect the fragile institutions of justice and democracy, for they are all that stand between us and the darkness that men like Riina represent. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your time and your attention. This has been the story of the ghost of Sicily. Until our next exploration, take care and remain curious.